You're about to hear a story that begins with fear but doesn't end there. It's about a wild, wounded dog and the quiet boy who refused to give up on him. If you believe that healing comes in silent moments and that even the most broken hearts can learn to trust again, stay with us. Gently tap that like button, subscribe for more stories that warm the soul, and let's walk into the woods together, where something beautiful is waiting to be found. The morning air in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina held a biting chill. Autumn had bled its last colors weeks ago, leaving behind trees stripped bare and trails of brittle leaves crunching underfoot. A storm had swept through the previous night, muddying the forest paths and dragging sharp winds through the narrow valleys near the town of Black Hollow. A sleepy place where time seemed to move a little slower, and the people had long since learned to keep their secrets. At the edge of the national forest, a search and rescue crew was navigating a dense underbrush following a local hiker's report of an injured animal crying out deep in the thickets. The team moved cautiously, unsure of what they'd find, deer, maybe, or a trapped coyote. But as they drew nearer to the sound, the forest fell into a strange hush, as if even the wind was waiting. Then they saw him. A German shepherd, large and lean, lay crouched near a thicket of wild juniper. One front leg tangled in a loop of steel wire, a hunter's illegal snare, half buried in the damp soil. The dog's fur was thick but matted, streaked with dried mud and splatters of blood. His right ear was notched, and one eye bore a faint milky haze, as if long ago scratched and never treated. He looked no older than 4, though survival had aged him. But the most striking thing wasn't the wound or the size of him. It was the look in his eyes, a frozen, defiant panic. He didn't whimper. He didn't bark. He stared, rigid, his body wound like a bowstring. The moment one rescuer stepped forward, the dog lunged not to attack, but to escape. The wire snapped taut, stopping him mid-motion with a sharp yelp that tore through the woods like a warning bell. The team couldn't get close. Every approach was met with snarls and snapping jaws. Finally, they called in the only person who might stand a chance. Dr. Eliza Moore arrived in a weathered forest green pickup, splattered with old paint and field dust. At 45, Eliza carried herself with the steady patience of someone who'd seen too much pain to rush healing. She was tall, lean, with sun-lined cheeks and dark brown hair always tied back in a low, messy ponytail. Her eyes green, steady, almost sad told stories of silent battles fought. A retired field vet who had once served in natural disaster zones, she had returned to her home state 5 years ago after losing her teenage son, Caleb, in a rock slide during a hiking trip. Since then, she had run Echo Pines Rescue Part Clinic, part sanctuary, part silent apology, to a world she couldn't save. She walked up to the clearing slowly, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The team stepped back as she neared. No gloves, no sedation, no catch-pole. She crouched 10 feet away. "You've got fight," she whispered almost to herself. "But I'm not here to win it." The dog didn't move. His body quivered, not from cold, but from tension so tight it was near breaking. He didn't take his eyes off her. Eliza could see the tremor in his muscles, the twitch of his ears catching every sound. This was no stray. This was an animal who had survived, fought, fled, endured. There was intelligence behind the fear, trauma wrapped in fur and muscle. The crew watched, waiting for a command or a retreat. But Eliza just sat. 5 minutes. 10. Finally, she pulled a thin, soft blanket from her bag and laid it in the mud between them. Then, with slow movements, she pulled out a small piece of cooked chicken and placed it on the edge of the fabric. Not too close, not too far, just enough. The dog's nostrils twitched. He didn't move, but his breathing shifted, a tiny signal. "I'm calling him Whiskey," Eliza said aloud, standing slowly. "Because he's scarred and burned and bitter, but maybe, just maybe, he'll warm your soul." They didn't try to lift him. Instead, Eliza requested a large animal trap cage and gently herded Whiskey toward it by placing more meat in a trail. He didn't walk. He limped with great caution, his gaze always locked on Eliza. No sudden movements, no threats, just space and silence. It took over an hour, but Whiskey finally entered the cage. Back at Echo Pines, rescue a modest but sturdy facility nestled between old pine groves. Eliza supervised Whiskey's arrival. The building smelled of cedar shavings and iodine, with faint jazz music always playing somewhere in the background. It wasn't just for the animals. It was for her too, a kind of rhythm that kept her moving forward. Inside the intake room stood Tanya, a petite woman in her early 30s with a cascade of red curls and a Boston accent that hadn't dulled in 10 years. Tanya had worked with Eliza since the clinic's founding. Fiercely protective of the animals, she was quick to speak and quicker to act, but gentle once trust was earned. She raised an eyebrow as Eliza guided the cage in. "Another one from the woods?" "This one's different," Eliza replied. "He's not lost. He's hiding." They prepped a quarantine kennel lined with thick blankets, water, a corner for shade, and left the cage door open. Whiskey didn't bolt. He didn't explore. He lay there, head down, one eye watching everything. Not once did he wag his tail. That night, Eliza stayed behind after closing. The storm had cleared, revealing a starlit sky beyond the wire mesh windows. She sat across from Whiskey's enclosure, a thermos of black tea in hand. She didn't speak, didn't move, just breathed, slow and steady. Hours passed. The dog never took his eyes off her, but he didn't look away either. That to Eliza was enough. She whispered, "Good night, Whiskey," as the clock ticked toward midnight, her heart oddly full for the first time in months. The morning after Whiskey's arrival at Echo Pine's rescue was one of soft light and quiet resolve. A thin fog clung to the forested edges of the sanctuary grounds, weaving through the pine trunks like a secret not yet spoken. Inside the main kennel wing, the shelter stirred to life with the shuffling of paws, the clinking of metal bowls, and the soft murmur of voices exchanging tasks. But in the isolation corridor, tucked away from the noise, time moved differently. Whiskey lay motionless in the farthest corner of his kennel, body curled tight, muzzle resting flat against the blanket-covered concrete floor. The room was silent, save for the occasional distant bark or the creak of a mop bucket wheel down the hall. The heavy steel bars between him and the world outside seemed more metaphorical than physical, as if they guarded the bruised remnants of trust itself. Dr. Eliza Moore stood several feet away, not in her usual scrubs, but in an old cable-knit sweater, the color of dried moss and faded jeans tucked into mud-splattered boots. Her hair was pulled up into a careless bun, and her hands were tucked deep into her pockets as she observed Whiskey through the silence. She didn't move closer. She didn't speak. She simply watched and waited. "He hasn't touched the food," came a voice behind her, soft but clear. It belonged to Evan Rosenthal, a young intern barely 23, with a wiry frame, pale skin freckled from childhood summers in Montana, and perpetually messy blonde hair. His posture always leaned slightly forward, as though pulled by an eagerness to help he hadn't yet learned to pace. Evan had joined Echo Pines just 6 weeks prior, fresh out of veterinary undergrad, full of questions and gentle optimism. He had taken to cleaning the isolation kennels with unexpected grace, often humming folk songs under his breath. "He'll eat when he's ready," Eliza replied without turning, her voice steady but low. "His body's hungry, but his mind's still surviving." Whiskey didn't flinch. His breathing was shallow, chest barely rising beneath his thick coat. His eyes, a deep burnished amber, were open watching, not in panic, not in surrender. Simply watching as if trying to memorize every movement that might signal danger. Evan crouched beside Eliza, keeping a respectful distance from the enclosure. "I've seen fear," he whispered, "but this is something else." "It's refusal," Eliza said. "Refusal to yield. That look, it's what animals wear when they've learned that every touch is a test of survival." She stepped back and pulled out her phone. Instead of taking photos or notes, she opened a music app and scrolled for a moment. Then gently she played a soft instrumental tune, piano, slow, meandering like wind through tall grass. The melody floated through the air, filling the sterile space with something almost tender. Whiskey's ears twitched, a small reaction, but it was the first voluntary motion they'd seen all morning. "He heard that," Evan said, eyes lighting up. "He didn't flinch. That's the point," Eliza murmured. "He listened." Outside the isolation wing, the day moved forward. Tanya was helping a local foster family adopt a 3-legged tabby cat named Miso, who had lost her leg after an accident with a tractor. Miso's story had drawn in the couple's daughter, Abby, an 8-year-old with a big voice and an even bigger collection of animal stickers on her backpack. Tanya, ever the negotiator, had softened her stern manner with Abby, teaching her how to gently hold the carrier and whisper to Miso to ease her nerves. The adoption was a small victory, but it gave the center hope. Every animal who found a home made room for another. Back inside, Eliza remained in the hallway, moving only to refill Whiskey's water and replace the untouched food with a fresh bowl. She said nothing when he ignored it. She didn't reach out. She simply folded her legs beneath her and sat again, this time not across the room, but just outside the kennel door. Enough for him to smell her if he wanted. Enough to be seen, but not feared. As the afternoon wore on, the shadows in the corridor shifted. Sunlight filtered through a small, high window, casting a fractured rectangle of golden light across the floor. Eliza noticed it landed just inches from Whiskey's nose. He blinked. Then he blinked again. Eliza saw it, that tiny, imperceptible gesture, an acknowledgement, not of her presence, but of the world outside his pain. That evening, as staff began winding down, Tanya stopped by to check on Eliza. "You're going to sit yourself into a stiff spine," she said, tossing a soft rolled blanket her way. "Here, at least lean on something." Eliza caught it with a faint smile. He blinked. Tanya raised an eyebrow, then glanced at Whiskey. "That all?" "It's the first thing he's done that wasn't about hiding," Eliza said. "Well," Tanya sighed, "you always did know how to read silence like a book." By nightfall, Echo Pines quieted. Most of the lights were dimmed, the kennels closed. But Eliza stayed a little longer. She left a worn tennis ball, not in the enclosure, but just outside the bars, far enough to be safe, close enough to be seen. Then she stepped back and whispered, "Your pace, Whiskey. Your way." Whiskey didn't move, but his eyes flicked once, just briefly toward the ball, then back to Eliza. She smiled, turned off the light, and walked away. He didn't look away until long after she was gone. The third day began, with a brittle wind hissing through the pine needles that hung like whispers above Echo Pine's rescue. The sky was the color of steel, and frost clung to the outer windows of the isolation wing, painting each pane with delicate spiderwebs of ice. Inside, the warmth of the shelter wrapped the hallways like a thick quilt, and the scent of cinnamon oatmeal, courtesy of Tanya's morning routine, drifted in faint waves. Whiskey lay in his familiar corner, but something had changed. He wasn't curled into a ball as before. His body was still, alert, but not taut. His head was up. His gaze was fixed not with suspicion, but with watchfulness. The tennis ball Eliza had left near the bars remained untouched, but its position had shifted ever so slightly. Someone had nudged it, and there was only someone who could have. Eliza entered quietly, holding a fresh thermos and wearing her faded maroon scarf, the one Caleb had given her during a Christmas long gone. It still smelled faintly of cedar and firewood. Her eyes lit up the moment she saw Whiskey's posture. She didn't speak. Instead, she lowered herself into her usual spot, sitting cross-legged just beyond the gate. "Morning," she murmured after a while, not expecting an answer, only offering presence. She placed another piece of cooked chicken smaller than yesterday, slightly closer to the bars. Then she opened her notebook, jotting observations in looping cursive while occasionally looking up. Whiskey stared back, unblinking. From down the hallway came the sound of sneakers pattering against linoleum, quick, uneven, too light to belong to staff. The door creaked open just a sliver, and a small figure peeked inside. It was Benji. At 10 years old, Benji Walker had an odd way of moving, like someone always bracing for bad news. His sandy hair stuck out in chaotic tufts, and his hoodie sleeves were stretched from nervous fidgeting. He had arrived at Echo Pines 2 weeks earlier through the county's transitional care program, his foster placement delayed after a fire had destroyed the home of his previous caretaker. Eliza had agreed to take him temporarily, using the spare room in the loft above the clinic. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, preferred sketchbooks to conversation, and had formed an immediate attachment to the animals, especially those that didn't want to be touched. "I didn't mean to sneak," Benji said softly, stepping inside with a shy glance toward Eliza. "I just wanted to see if he was okay." Eliza motioned him closer but kept her voice low. "He's not ready for a crowd, but I think he knows we're trying." Benji approached with care, stopping beside her and sitting down. He pulled something from his pocket, a folded piece of paper, slightly smudged with pencil. It was a sketch of Whiskey lying in his kennel, eyes glowing like 2 moons. The drawing wasn't perfect, but it held a truth that Eliza felt deeply. This was how Benji saw the dog, powerful, mysterious, alone. "Can I give this to him?" the boy asked. Eliza nodded, and together they slid the paper gently under the kennel gate. Whiskey didn't react immediately. Then, slowly, he turned his head. His gaze flicked to the paper, then to Benji, then back to Eliza. That was when Eliza decided to try something different. "Stay still," she whispered to Benji, then shifted carefully onto her knees and reached into her pocket for a smaller piece of meat, barely a mouthful, and held it between her fingers, palm open, low to the ground but clearly visible. Whiskey watched, his breath shallow, his ears twitched. Seconds passed, then minutes. Finally, in a moment so tentative it barely registered, Whiskey crept forward, just one paw, dragging himself an inch closer. His body remained low, almost slithering across the blanket. But he didn't retreat. Eliza didn't breathe. Benji bit his lip so hard it turned white. Whiskey's nose twitched. His eyes flicked between the meat and the woman's outstretched hand. Then, with agonizing slowness, he stepped forward again, his injured leg dragging slightly. His whiskers brushed against Eliza's fingers. He hesitated. And then he took the food. No snatch, no panic. He took it gently, retreating only 2 steps before curling again, chewing slowly. Eliza exhaled softly, tears pooling in her eyes. She didn't move her hand, didn't say a word. She let the silence affirm what words never could. Benji leaned toward her, whispering, "He trusts you." "Not yet," she replied, her voice trembling. "But he wants to." That evening, long after the clinic had closed, Eliza reviewed her notes under a dim lamp in her loft office. Benji sat nearby, coloring in a picture of a dog with stars for eyes. The world outside had darkened into a quiet snowfall, coating the porch railings and surrounding woods in winter's first hush. Down in the kennel, Whiskey lay facing the gate. The drawing was still there, unchewed, untouched. But it had been moved, not by wind, not by staff. Moved closer, toward the inside. The following morning dawned with a brittle sky, the color of frost-bitten slate. A quiet snow had dusted the surrounding woods during the night, muffling every step around Echo Pine's rescue into soft, near-silent footfalls. The pine trees outside the clinic shimmered faintly, as if dipped in powdered sugar. Inside, the isolation wing was warm and dim, with Whiskey still curled near the back of his kennel. Though this time, his head was lifted, his eyes already watching when Eliza entered. She carried no food today, no treats. Oh. Only a worn leather-bound journal under one arm and a fleece blanket draped over her shoulder. Her posture was softer, shoulders relaxed beneath her oversized gray cardigan, and the fine lines beside her eyes deepened when she smiled. There was something quieter about her this morning, as if the snow had hushed not just the world, but her own guarded spirit. Her steps were slower, more deliberate. She was ready for something deeper. Whiskey's gaze followed her every movement, but he didn't retreat. Eliza knelt by the gate and sat cross-legged once more. Her breath fogged faintly in the still cool corridor air, and for a few moments she said nothing. Then she opened the journal in her lap and flipped through until she found a page A drawing, hand-sketched, faded but clearly of a German shepherd. The resemblance was uncanny, not exact, but close. The same proud ears, the same thick ruff of fur around the shoulders. The drawing had been done in soft pencil, smudged at the corners from being touched too many times. "This was Caleb's," she said quietly, though no one else was in the room. "He used to draw every dog we ever met. This was a stray we saw on the roadside one summer. He swore it smiled at him." She slid the journal across the floor, letting it come to rest a few inches from the gate. Whiskey didn't move, but his ears tilted slightly forward. Eliza let out a long, quiet breath. "I'm not trying to tame you, boy. I'm just trying to understand where you've been." Later that morning, she returned with Tanya. Today they needed to assess Whiskey's injuries. The limp had grown less pronounced, but the wound on his foreleg still hadn't fully closed, and he needed a proper exam. Eliza moved first, crouching again, speaking softly. Then, slowly, she unlocked the gate and stepped inside the kennel for the first time. Whiskey remained still, but his body was tense, eyes flicking rapidly between Eliza and Tanya. "We'll keep it brief," Eliza murmured. Tanya, practical, sharp-tongued but gentle when it mattered, was in her early 30s, with quick hands and a quicker mind. Her red curls were tied back into a tight bun, and her navy vest was lined with gauze rolls and alcohol swabs. She didn't speak much to animals the way Eliza did, but she respected their silence, understood the weight of it. Together, they moved slowly. Eliza approached with a rolled towel in one hand, not to restrain, but to serve as a buffer, while Tanya stood just inside the door, letting her presence be felt without pressing forward. Whiskey didn't snarl, but his breathing hitched, his tail rigid against the floor. Eliza murmured calming tones and knelt closer, reaching with the back of her hand toward his shoulder. When she made contact, she didn't press, just let him feel the warmth of her skin. Whiskey shivered, a full-body tremor, but didn't pull away. As she slid her hand along his side, Eliza finally saw it beneath the thick fur near his ribs, a series of old scars, thin, straight, cruel, the kind left by a blade or a whip. Tanya inhaled sharply behind her. "Jesus!" Eliza didn't respond. She traced one of the scars gently, almost reverently, and her voice shook when she spoke. Someone hurt him on purpose. This wasn't just survival. Whiskey shifted slightly, leaning not in comfort, but in a way that acknowledged her touch. Eliza didn't press further. She sat back and simply placed the new fleece blanket at the edge of his space, folded and clean. Then she nodded once to Tanya, and they both stepped out. That afternoon, while cleaning kennels, Evan passed by the isolation wing. Seeing Eliza sitting on the floor again, he paused. "He let you touch him?" "Just enough to tell a story," she replied, glancing up from her notebook. Evan crouched beside her and peered inside. "You think he remembers?" Eliza didn't hesitate. "He never forgot." Meanwhile, Benji sat in the common area by the window, sketching again. Today's drawing was different. It showed Whiskey lying beside a child, their heads touching. In the picture, the child wasn't Benji. It wasn't anyone he knew. It was how he imagined comfort looked, how it might feel if someone, or something, chose to stay. That evening, after the sun had dipped behind the ridge and the shelter settled into its night rhythm, Eliza returned for one last visit. The hallway was dim, the only light a small motion sensor lamp overhead. She approached Whiskey's kennel with quiet steps and found the blanket she had left earlier was no longer where she'd placed it. It was beneath him now. He was lying on it. Eliza smiled faintly and whispered, "We're getting there." And for the first time since his arrival, Whiskey's eyes closed in her presence, not in fear, but in rest. The wind howled through the pines that morning, carrying a sharper bite than usual. Snow had crusted into patches of ice, making the gravel paths around Echo Pines slick and treacherous. Inside the main building, a tension hung in the air, not born from the cold, but from something that had yet to unfold. Whiskey had shown promising progress in recent days. He now approached the kennel gate without fear, and sometimes sat close when Eliza spoke to him. Each morning, his blanket was found tidily arranged beneath him, and the tennis ball had moved progressively deeper inside the enclosure, as if he were beginning to claim the space. There was still distance in his eyes, but it was no longer laced with terror, only caution. That morning, however, a training session was underway in the adjacent wing. A new volunteer had brought in a pair of rescue dogs with behavioral issues, and one of them had bolted. In the scramble to regain control, a long leather leash had snapped against the concrete floor with a loud, cracking echo, sharp, sudden, and far too familiar. The sound sliced through the hall like a whip through memory. In Whiskey's kennel, everything unraveled in seconds. One moment, he was lying still, his breathing calm. The next, he was on his feet, eyes wild, ears flattened. He let out a guttural snarl, one none of the staff had heard before, and lunged toward the gate. The metal clanged violently as he collided with it, rattling the hinges. Before anyone could respond, the latch improperly secured gave way. Whiskey bolted. A young handler named Miguel had just entered the hallway, carrying a clipboard and wearing bright orange gloves. He was no older than 25, tall with a friendly face and an easy smile, new to Echo Pines only 2 weeks prior. He had a habit of talking too much when nervous and whistling pop songs while walking between wings. Today, he didn't even see it coming. Whiskey barreled into him, jaws bared, adrenaline flooding every muscle. The collision knocked Miguel to the ground, and in his panic, he threw up his arms, gloved fingers flailing, and screamed. That sound, that posture, something in it triggered a reflex buried deep in Whiskey's trauma. He bit, not deep, not savage. A defensive, instinctive snap, his teeth catching Miguel's forearm. enough to draw blood, but not maim, but the damage was done. Miguel shrieked, and two other staff members rushed in, pulling Whiskey away with catch poles. The German shepherd fought blindly, his tail tucked, his body trembling uncontrollably. It took several minutes to secure him back inside the kennel, where he collapsed into the far corner, panting, body convulsing with silent tremors. Within the hour, the situation had escalated. The shelter director, Karen Lawton, arrived with hurried steps and clipped words. A woman in her mid-50s, Karen was known for her structured hair, pressed blazers, and clinical precision. Her face, always composed, was today drawn tight with anxiety. She was not heartless, but she was pragmatic, and Echo Pines operated under strict liability rules. "An animal that bites is a liability," she said to Eliza, behind closed doors. "You know the policy." "It wasn't aggression," Eliza replied, hands clenched in her lap. "It was a trauma response. A sound triggered a memory. He's not dangerous." Karen crossed her arms. "Intent doesn't matter to donors or insurance companies. I'm placing him on the removal list until the board reviews." "You're sentencing him," Eliza snapped. Karen's voice softened slightly. "I'm suspending your direct involvement until we determine the next step. For your own protection too, Eliza." And just like that, Eliza was locked out from the one soul she had worked weeks to reach. Whiskey, now isolated again, refused food. He tore the blanket. He lay rigid for hours, eyes fixed on the far wall, unmoving even when staff passed. The progress they had made seemed to vanish in a single day. But someone else wasn't ready to give up. That evening, long after the last light had been turned off, Benji crept quietly down the stairs from the loft. He wore mismatched socks and an oversized hoodie that brushed the tops of his knees. In one hand, he carried his sketchbook, and in the other, a small, battery-powered lantern. His footsteps were careful, silent, rehearsed. He slipped through the hallway with the practiced stealth of someone used to being overlooked. When he reached Whiskey's kennel, he didn't speak. He simply sat cross-legged outside the gate, just as Eliza always had. The lantern cast a warm glow, painting soft amber across the floor. Whiskey didn't look at him, but his ears twitched. Benji flipped open his sketchbook and began to hum. Not loud, not clear. Just a soft, wobbly tune one he'd made up months ago when his foster home had burned down. And he'd been told he had to leave his dog behind. The same tune he'd hummed in the dark corners of emergency shelters, curled up on cots too cold, surrounded by people who never looked him in the eye. Tonight, he gave the tune to Whiskey, and slowly, the trembling stopped. After a few minutes, Benji slid a new drawing under the gate. This one showed Whiskey not alone, not snarling, but standing beside a boy, with trees behind them and stars overhead. In the picture, both the boy and the dog were smiling. Whiskey didn't approach the sketch, but his head turned. His eyes haunted and wide met Benji's. And he blinked. The cold had softened by morning, giving way to a pale thaw that melted thin lines of ice off the clinic's roof. Water dripped steadily from the eaves, collecting into a rhythm like a quiet heartbeat outside Echo Pines. The storm of the previous day had left more than just broken branches and scattered snow. It had shattered the fragile trust built between Whiskey and the people who believed in him. Eliza stood once again in the boardroom of the rescue center, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of coffee gone cold. Across from her sat Karen Lawton, the shelter director, her blazer a perfect crease-free shade of charcoal. She tapped her pen against the edge of her clipboard, her mouth a thin line of consideration. "Let me be clear," Karen said. "This is not a decision I'm making lightly. One more incident, just one, and he's out." Eliza nodded. Her eyes held none of their usual warmth. They were tired, glassy, but steady. "Give me 2 weeks. No adoption pushing, no press, just me, Benji, and the dog. No one else near him." Karen raised a brow. "Benji, the child?" "He's the only one Whiskey responded to after the incident. I saw the security footage." After a long pause, Karen sighed and finally set down her clipboard. 2 weeks, supervised. That afternoon, Eliza found Benji in the small greenhouse behind the clinic. He sat on a bench beside a potted rosemary plant, his sketchbook balanced on his knees, drawing a scene of a treehouse nestled between branches. Somewhere that didn't exist, not really, but should have. When she told him the news, he didn't cheer or grin. He just nodded with quiet solemnity, as if already aware of the gravity of the mission. "I want to help," he said simply. Eliza studied him for a moment. The way he never quite met her eyes, the way his fingers were always fidgeting with his pencil or sleeves. So many kids might have recoiled from whiskey after what happened, but Benji had gone the other way. He had leaned in. "You'll be his therapy partner," Eliza said softly. "You just need to be yourself." That evening, under a soft pink sky, they began the first session. Whiskey remained in his kennel, though the door had been replaced with a reinforced barrier, half glass, half mesh, so he could see clearly, but not bolt. Eliza didn't enter, neither did Benji. They simply sat outside, placing a fresh blanket, a bowl of food, and a new sketch by the door. This time, it was a picture of a door opening, not metaphorically, but literal, drawn wide with light spilling from behind it. In the foreground was a dog's silhouette, stepping forward. Whiskey didn't move for an hour. Then, slowly, cautiously, he inched forward, sniffed the blanket, then laid down. Each day the same. Eliza introduced simple voice cues: stay, easy, look. At first, there was nothing. Then came flickers, a twitch of the ear, a subtle glance. Each time Benji came, Whiskey seemed calmer, more grounded. He didn't growl when Benji sat nearby. Once, he even let the boy's fingers brush gently against his side through the mesh without flinching. By the end of the first week, Whiskey no longer bolted at sudden sounds. He startled, yes, but he did not snarl. And when Eliza entered the kennel during one quiet morning, this time with no barrier, no backup, only a leash draped loosely at her side, Whiskey stood and waited. She extended a flat palm. "Come." He hesitated, then took 2 slow steps forward and pressed his nose to her fingers. Outside the room, Tanya watched from a discreet distance. She hadn't said much since the incident. The fiery assistant vet had taken it hard. Miguel had healed fast, but the blow to their center's reputation was still raw. But seeing Whiskey now, responding, choosing calm, something shifted. "Maybe the kid's the secret ingredient," she muttered, almost to herself. In the common area, Evan was cleaning out the food bins when he paused and glanced through the glass wall. He'd been skeptical at first, having seen animals fail in the past, despite everyone's best efforts. But something about Whiskey made him hope. Maybe it was the scars, maybe the silence, maybe the way Benji quietly cared. On the last day of the second week, Eliza, Benji, and Whiskey stood together in the enclosed outdoor yard. Snow had melted into patches of mud and winter grass. A few brittle leaves clung desperately to the trees. Whiskey, now stronger, coat brushed clean, stood at Eliza's side with a loose lid draped over his back. Not clipped on, just resting. Benji stood a few feet ahead, holding out his hand. "Whiskey, come," Eliza said. The dog's ears twitched. He looked between the two, then took a few steps forward, tail low, but relaxed. He reached Benji, sniffed his hand, then sat. Benji grinned, not broadly, but the kind of quiet smile that means something inside has lifted. From behind the glass, Karen watched in silence, her arms crossed. She didn't say a word as she turned and walked back into her office. That night, as the shelter lights dimmed, Eliza stood by Whiskey's kennel once more. He sat calmly inside, the gate wide open. She didn't give commands, she didn't speak. Instead, Whiskey stood, walked to her, and placed his head gently against her leg. For the first time in weeks, Eliza let her hand rest fully on his head, fingers threading through the fur that once bristled at touch. Whiskey leaned into it. A door had opened, not one made of steel, but one stitched into memory, pain, and silence. And this time, no one was forcing it open. The morning broke with pale sunlight slanting through the high branches of the pines, casting golden shards onto the frozen grass. There was a kind of quiet expectancy in the air at Echo Pines, the sort that usually came before an adoption day or the arrival of a new animal. But today, the stillness held something more personal, like the world itself was holding its breath for what was to come. Inside the shelter, Eliza stood by the kennel door, glancing down at the leash in her hand. Not clipped on, just there, loosely curled like a question waiting to be answered. Whiskey sat beside her, his ears perked and tail resting calmly along the floor. His coat was thick and clean now, the bruised patches of old scars nearly hidden beneath soft waves of fur. His amber eyes had changed, not entirely free of shadow, but no longer ruled by them. Eliza, now in her navy utility jacket and thick winter scarf, knelt slowly beside him. "You don't have to prove anything," she whispered. "Just be you." Across the hall stood Benji, now slightly taller than when he first arrived. A winter beanie covered his unruly blonde hair, and a dark green hoodie draped over his narrow frame. He held a folded piece of paper in one hand, a new drawing, though he hadn't shown it to anyone yet. He gave Whiskey a soft nod, more like a promise than a cue. The door was opened. Whiskey stepped out. Not bolted, not rushed. Stepped. Together, the three walked into the enclosed therapy yard behind the main building. A small gathering of staff had assembled. Tanya, arms crossed but a faint smile curling her lips. Evan, holding a clipboard but not pretending to take notes. Even Miguel, the handler Whiskey had once bitten, was present, his arm now fully healed, wearing thick gloves but a relaxed expression. Today was the demonstration, the one the board had insisted on. A final test to determine whether Whiskey could be trusted as a therapeutic support animal. Eliza hadn't agreed with the premise, but she had accepted the necessity. The therapy yard had been arranged to mimic a low-stress family-style visit. A few benches, scattered toys, even soft music played on a speaker hidden beneath a bush. It felt more like a weekend picnic than an evaluation. Then came the children. A group of 6 kids ranging in age from 5 to 11 had been invited through a partnership program with a local foster support group. Each child had their own story. Some in care, some recently adopted, some quiet, some loud. Among them was Mason, a wiry 7-year-old boy with curly black hair, oversized boots, and a constant scowl. He had been removed from 3 foster homes in under a year, known for anger outbursts and refusal to speak to adults. He didn't want to be there. He kicked a pebble hard across the yard and crossed his arms. "This is dumb," he muttered. Whiskey noticed him immediately. While most of the kids gravitated toward the other dogs brought out for the day, gentler, known companions, Whiskey didn't move toward the crowd. Instead, he walked slowly in the direction of Mason, body relaxed, ears slightly tilted. Mason glared. "Don't come near me." Whiskey didn't flinch. He simply sat a few feet away, tail swishing once, and waited. Benji watched from the edge of the yard. "He's not pushing him," he said to Eliza quietly. "He's just there." "He knows what it means to be pushed too hard," Eliza replied. Then came the unexpected. One of the younger boys, a chubby-cheeked 6-year-old named Theo, had been running too fast across the muddy lawn. His foot caught a slick patch, and he tumbled hard, face first, into the grass. For a moment, there was silence, then a sharp cry. The staff moved to help, but they weren't the first. Whiskey was. He trotted, not rushed, across the yard to the boy's side, sniffed him gently, then did something no one expected. He leaned down and gave a slow, deliberate lick to Theo's cheek. Theo blinked through tears. "Doggy," he whispered. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. Karen, standing further back with a board member named James, gray-haired, skeptical, always chewing mints, raised an eyebrow. Tanya's voice, though low, carried through the air. "He chose to comfort. That's instinct, not training." Whiskey then turned and looked back toward Mason, who was still watching, jaw slightly open. Later, when the demonstration wrapped and the children filed back toward the van waiting outside, something even more extraordinary happened. Mason walked back alone, arms still folded. But just before reaching the door, he turned, jogged 3 steps back to where Whiskey stood near the gate, and did something no one expected. He reached out and touched his head. Just once. Whiskey didn't move. Mason turned and left without a word. Back inside, the staff met in the small conference room. The votes were unanimous. Karen looked across the table. As of today, Whiskey is officially cleared to remain at Echo Pines as a certified therapeutic animal in residence. Eliza closed her eyes for a second, letting the words sink in. Benji, sitting on a stool nearby, finally unfolded his drawing and showed it to her. It was of Whiskey, standing tall beside a group of children beneath a winter tree. In the sky above, tiny stars dotted the page. But they weren't stars. They were paw prints. "Looks like he found his pack," Benji said. That night, after the sun dipped behind the ridge, Eliza opened Whiskey's kennel door one more time. Not because he needed to be let out, but because he didn't need to be kept in. And Whiskey? He walked straight to her, rested his head gently against her side, and stood there, still and content. The choice had been made. The frost that once clung stubbornly to the pine branches now melted with the soft breath of early spring. Snow had receded to the shadows, giving way to patches of wet soil and budding green, as if the earth itself was exhaling after a long-held breath. At Echo Pine's rescue, something deeper had shifted, something that couldn't be measured in degrees or daylight hours. Whiskey had become more than a rescue, more than a survivor. He was now a quiet sentinel, a presence that anchored the most broken children who passed through the shelter's wooden gates. The therapy room had been repurposed into a quiet sanctuary, scattered with oversized cushions, soft blankets, low shelves of toys, and a beanbag corner where children could curl up out of view. And always without being called or instructed, Whiskey would be there, lying calmly at the center of the room, his tail twitching slowly with each breath, his eyes following every movement with gentle curiosity. When frightened children entered, most would hesitate near the doorway, overwhelmed by the newness. But then they would see the dog, still, quiet, and unbothered by tears or silence or fear. He never approached first. He only waited, and inevitably they would draw closer. Some sat beside him. Some laid their heads against his warm side and wept. Some just rested their tiny fingers on his back for minutes without saying a word. Whiskey never flinched. He simply stayed. He had found his place. Benji, too, had changed. He no longer avoided eye contact or hid behind his sketchbook. Though the trauma of his past hadn't disappeared, it no longer defined him. He walked with more certainty, stood a little taller. He still sketched often animals, forests, impossible creatures with wings and glowing eyes. But now he shared those drawings, even taped a few on the shelter's common room wall. One drawing depicted Whiskey seated like a king in a hall of children, wearing a soft crown of branches and stars. Another showed a boy and a dog walking into a forest trail with the words, "Home is where someone waits," written at the bottom. On one afternoon, a new child arrived, a girl named Lila, age 9. She was pale, with raven-black hair cut blunt at the jaw, and eyes that never blinked long enough to reveal what was behind them. She had come from a home that everyone at Echo Pines only spoke about in low voices, filled with too many shadows. Lila didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply sat, hands tucked into her sleeves, knees drawn up to her chest. Eliza, now back to full hours at the center, observed quietly from the corner. Her hair had grown longer this winter, streaks of silver catching in the sunlight. There was a quiet steadiness in her, now a kind of acceptance born not from resignation, but from healing. She no longer carried the heavy ache of needing to fix everything. Instead, she simply stayed present, letting the work unfold on its own terms. Lila avoided every adult that day, but Whiskey sat beside her, not touching, just close. And in the late hours, when most had left, Lila whispered something no one heard. She pressed her forehead against Whiskey's neck, and for the first time since her arrival, she slept. These were the miracles Echo Pines had begun to witness. Not dramatic or showy, but quiet and unassuming. The kind that rewired something deep inside a child's mind. The kind that told them, you are not alone. One evening, as golden dusk draped itself over the shelter grounds, Eliza stood on the front porch with a mug of warm chamomile. Whiskey sat beside her, his gaze on the edge of the forest line. Benji was nearby, leaning against the railing, flipping through his sketchbook absent-mindedly. "Do you think he remembers where he came from?" Benji asked suddenly. Eliza glanced down at Whiskey. "He remembers," she said, "but it doesn't rule him anymore." Benji nodded thoughtfully. "I think he saved me too." Eliza looked at him, not just a boy anymore, but someone who had walked through fire and come out stronger on the other side. "I think you saved each other." That night, as the stars blinked softly into the sky and the wind rustled gently through the trees, the shelter quieted into sleep. And in the sanctuary room, Whiskey lay curled on a blanket, a child's small hand tucked in the fur at his neck. He did not move. He did not sleep. He only listened, heart steady, still guarding, still giving. He was no longer the wild creature who trembled at every sound. He had become a healer. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it walks in, quietly on 4 cautious paws, in the silence between 2 heartbeats, or in the eyes of a child who chooses to stay. Whiskey didn't just overcome his fear, he helped others face theirs. Through him, broken children found comfort. A lonely boy found belonging, and a weary woman found purpose again. And perhaps that was no coincidence, because when we open our hearts to what's wounded, even if it bares its teeth at first, grace finds a way in. In the quiet corners of life, God still whispers through the lives we choose to save, and those that save us in return. If whiskey's journey stirred something in your heart, share this story with someone who needs light today. Leave a comment and tell us how one moment of compassion changed your life. And if you believe in healing, second chances, and the quiet power of love, type Amen below. Don't forget to subscribe for more true stories of redemption, courage, and hope. May God bless you in every soul brave enough to love again.